Sankofa is home in so many ways. It's the only place where, celebrating Toni Cade Bambara, also here to celebrate and recognize Dr. John Hendrik Clark at one point, and now to be back home again. And also very, very grateful for Salame's support, particularly in Ethiopia, where I had an opportunity not to just interview midwives, but to talk with him about birthing justice movements on the continent, talking about developing birth centers, paying more attention to home birth and midwives. And I just want to say quickly, on my way here, we happened to have someone from Ethiopia as our Uber cab driver. And when I told him that I was going to be talking about midwives, his whole attitude changed, and he began telling the story about the midwife in Ethiopia who actually attended his birth and how much respect that he had for her in the community, and that she was the wise woman in the community. So more about that as we get into it. But I think maybe before I do that, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, but maybe just a little bit more about yourself.
Okay.
And yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Rashonda Mitchell, and I am what you would consider, Western medicine. So I'm a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and I particularly specialize in complicated births and pregnancies. That's what I do. And we know with the current crisis that we are having, epidemic, pandemic, if you want to call it, in maternal health, it is very essential that we all play a role in birthing persons' lived experience. So I have always, since I was 16-year-old, wanted to do obstetrics, had no clue about gynecology. And so throughout this whole journey to becoming maternal fetal medicine, I ended up right where I was supposed to be. And I have to tell you, today I had an epiphany moment because I'm actually still at work. Somebody's covering me right now. I've delivered 3 babies thus far.
Today?
Today. And I still have 3 more to go to deliver. But I came here for this experience. Why not? And so, I think it's so important because I find that a lot of people in our culture, to be honest, go to PWIs and other institutions, and we have an HBCU here, right here in our nation's capital, to me, which should be the center of Black maternal health, to be honest with you. Those with high-risk births and low-risk births, they should be able to come in and birth, and we should be the place for them to do that and have access to it, and we should celebrate it. And I will get more into that experience, but I went through fellowship and wanted to come back and return back to my roots. I did do fellowship here, and I know how much our community is in need here, and I felt like excellence should not exude or escape where we are, and it should come back home, and that's how I ended up back here at Howard.
Yeah, and I think that you should know the way that we met, right, was I was listening to the radio one Sunday morning, and it was midwives and doulas, and I'm thinking, I'm hearing a midwife speak, right? And it wasn't until further along in the conversation that I began to understand that in her heart, and I, from interviewing you, that she is a doctor who has really incorporated many of the ways of a midwife, right? And being concerned about the whole person, being concerned about the community, and so forth. But let me just read quickly from the book, and we're going to, these slides just to kind of give you an idea of the places that I've been and some of the midwives that I talked to that will be running, at the beginning, and we'll probably show them again towards the end. And I have to put my glasses on because I'm not going to be able to. Okay, and I'm reading this because I was introduced as a scholar, but this book really comes from my personal experience, right? When I gave birth at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paterson, New Jersey in 1976, I had no idea that my childbirth experience would launch a lifetime of work. 45 years later, I remain committed to activism and write in support of a growing birthing justice movement that aims to end inequities in birthing care and outcomes. I dedicate all of the stories in this book to that movement. The fire I bring to this work still burns from my engagement in the 1960s Black student revolutionary movement. On the Rutgers University campus, I was among the Black students who raised our fists in making demands that challenged structural racism, the abysmal lack of Black faculty in classes focusing on Black history, which makes me think about the Supreme Court situation just a couple of days ago, and Black students' underrepresentation in the student population in that state-funded institution. Preparing to give birth 6 years later felt like readying myself for a Black Power march on campus. But this time, the demand centered on seizing the power to make choices about my own childbirth experience. To prepare for childbirth, my partner, Welton Smith, and I took classes with Elizabeth Bing, known as the Mother of Lamaze, in her apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Smith, a journalist and a poet, was widely recognized for capturing the spirit of Malcolm X in his poem, first published in Black Fire, edited by the revolutionary poet Amiri Baraka. As we prepared to give birth to our daughter, who is here, Aju Agana Frisco Tashi Smith, we were the only Black couple in the Lamaze classes at that time, where we learned breathing techniques for relaxation, ways to negotiate having our partners in the delivery room, and how to avoid unnecessary drugs and technological interventions. Despite my preparation and determination to have my wishes respected, doctors administered Pitocin, a drug used to stimulate labor, and ordered an epidural, a procedure that injects a local anesthesia into the mother. And in an act, however, of self-empowerment, I refused to agree to an epidural unless my partner would be in the delivery room with me to provide support and to question the doctor. We also convinced the labor and delivery room nurses to agree to keep champagne chilled in the staff refrigerator for a celebration of Ghana's birth. That's when a nurse told me that I was the first in the hospital, this is 1976, to request rooming in with a newborn so that I could breastfeed my child on demand. After this birth experience, where I felt disempowered, I engaged as an activist who became part of a growing movement that focused on increasing access to birthing care that respected women's choices. Looking back, I can see now that my birthing experience more than 4 decades ago in a busy Patterson, New Jersey hospital with a doctor who I barely knew, was the beginning of a lifelong involvement in the birthing justice movement. Little did I know at that time, though, that my experience would drive me not just to learn more about the origins of alternative birthing methods and traditions here in the States, but that it would one day take me on this transatlantic journey to learn firsthand about birthing cultures on the continent from time immemorial, you all. Like, that's where it all comes from, right? From the continent. We are the first midwives. We are the first with birthing traditions. So we want this to be a conversation.
Yes.
So some thoughts about what I just read, maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, you said a lot of things that resonate with me. One, you felt empowered regarding your birthing experience, which I think is so important. You also advocated for yourself and your family to have your husband available to you during that time, which is something that I think is so essential to what we do. And I think that is so important. And I think you talked about the before, the birth experience, how you went to Lamaze classes, and you hinted to it earlier. I think one of the things we have to get back to as a culture is actually thinking about the experience beyond just the baby and the birth. We have to think about mom. I think we have lost our sense of mom and mothering and preparing for the birth prior to, which leads to us not being prepared to handle some of the things afterwards. And so I think those are things that were steps that were so important, and it was a celebration. And oftentimes I can say in many of the situations on the clinical side, I don't always see that celebration portion. And the majority of it is because there are women that are coming in and they are birthing by themselves. And that's from families to partners. And so when I see that, I know that this experience for this woman has not been full.
Yeah.
And that is the concerning part for me.
So it's interesting that you're saying that, because one of the things that I was struck by in collecting stories from midwives, not only on the continent, but in Alabama, where I interviewed midwives back in 1981. And that is how women gathered and created community for women, right,
Yes.
at the time of birth.
Yes.
And that the whole concept of birthing alone just didn't happen.
Right.
And that there was also this idea about celebration, right? And I know in Ethiopia, because that was some of the things that we were talking about when we had a chance to chat, that there was real live chanting and celebration around the time of birth, and then it was something that actually bonded community, right? That it made a woman feel that she was connected to her community during the time of birth. And there was one person that talked about the fact that at some point she felt like she was actually experiencing the birthing with her, so that there was this idea. But I'm trying to think now, how in the spaces that we have now, like I was talking about my own birth experience and how I had to fight to get the dad into the birthing space.
Right.
And even the birthing space itself, right?
Yeah.
You know, like you think about birth centers and those birthing spaces.
Yeah.
We think about on the continent, being outdoors, being close to earth, right? Having that kind of sense. So I'm trying to think about where you are now, women gathering,
Yeah.
and how also, because you're a mom.
Yes.
So maybe some of that, your sensitivity also in terms of those ideas, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that about, your the different traditions that you see. And I think that's so important that we bring that up in culture, because I can tell you, DC is a wonderful melting pot, so we get to see birthing persons from all over the place. And so there is a large cultural difference when people come in and birth. And I can honestly say that when on any given day, I can have somebody from the continent of Africa, or I can have somebody who is Hispanic, and then I can have someone who is African American, all laboring at the same time. And the support system may look a lot different. Hispanic family, it's like 5 of them in the waiting room. They are rotating in and out. There are people there supporting this birthing person. Sometimes from, of course, the continent of Africa, mom is usually there somewhere, or mother-in-law is usually there. And the expectation is that after they birth, they're going to breastfeed. Now, some in the African American community, they come in and they have a support person, a partner with them, but usually it's individual. And of course, the way this society works, they may have to leave because of work and other requirements. So it does look a lot different. It does look a lot different in the different birthing spaces, and I think that was so important to me when I became a mom. And as she stated before, how she met me is that I was doing a radio show discussing maternal mortality as a physician, and I was pregnant at the time. In one of the conversations, she said that really struck her was that I said I had to have a conversation with my husband, that if I became incapacitated and could not advocate for myself, he would be able to do that for me. And for us to sit and think that you have to think about your possible death in your child's birth was a real eye-opening experience. But I still needed him to advocate for me in that conversation. It was a conversation that you have to have, that I don't feel like everyone has to have. And it kind of brought me to tears that I had to actually think about that moment while I chose to have birth. And sure enough, as fate would have it, I did have a complication. And my husband was shaken to his core. I was in the hospital for like a whole week. And sure enough, some of my, and I'm a professional who knows the background, who knows the medicine, and when I advocated for myself, I was told, oh, you just need to be the patient.
Okay, so let me just stop right there, because that is what really caused me to kind of think about the fact. So when I had my daughter, we were not married, Welton and I were really close, but to think about the fact that here is someone who is an osteopathic physician, who has a background in nutrition, right? Who had, she did her undergraduate work at Fisk, did her, at Howard, came back to Howard, but there she is in Charlottesville.
Yes.
Where this is Thomas Jefferson, right? Going back where, Charlottesville had their first Black doctor, I think, maybe in the 1960s, right? So, and one of the stories in the book is about Mrs. Thelma Jackson Price, right, who gives birth in a tertiary hospital, supposedly the best hospital in Charlottesville, not that long ago, I think in the late 40s, early 50s, where she's giving birth in the basement of the hospital with water dripping down from the pipes, right? And not knowing who the doctor is that's going to attend her in childbirth, right? And she's doing this as a part of, which brings me to a whole other thing, a part of like the civil rights movement and wanting to have access to the quote white hospital and the quote prepared doctor, and that being angry, rightfully so, that not having the right to do that. But what really shook me when you told me that you as a physician, well qualified to participate in a discussion using the very terminology, right? So it's not like you have to, and we're talking about doulas trying to do this negotiation, but you yourself felt like you were not being respected as a Black woman, right? That you yourself felt like your peers were suddenly not your peers, right? That they were exhibiting that white supremacy, medical authority. So I'll let you kind of go back. But that really was.
I was literally, during the process I cried on the way to the OR because I didn't feel like I was heard. I did not want to have a C-section. I ended up having to have a C-section. And my thoughts, my decisions were not respected. And in that, I was very upset. But to minimize the scene that could have been had, I just relented for the well-being of my son and my husband, because he was concerned at that time, because he knew how upset I was, to just go ahead and have a C-section. It was not what I wanted to do, but I was told that if I didn't agree with the management, that I could find somebody else to tend to my delivery, because they were about to go. So that was one of the major things that I knew it was more of a systemic thing than it was an individual thing. And so when I attempt to provide care, I try to engage my patients. I inform them of risk and benefits, because I have that knowledge to know and have seen some of the risk and benefits with my patients. And I do allow them to make an autonomous decision on their own. But they do have to assume whatever risk is associated with that. And I tell them that. But I think that was one of the things that really hit home for me. And it's funny we're having this conversation, because I literally had an epiphany moment today. And I always ask, like, God, what is my talent? You know, everybody has talents. And I know I'm smart, but what is my talent? Like, I can't braid hair. I can't, I can't do all these wonderful things, sing. I don't have a body like Beyonce. So, like, what is my talent?
You are a beautiful black woman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I wondered, and as I was delivering those babies today, I said, this is my gift.
Yes.
And it hit me because I always believe that some people's career and their gift don't align. And I think I'm extremely blessed to know that my gift lines up with my actual career. And that means so much to me. And I actually, thank you. I can't tell you, I love what I do. And like, I'm the person, my husband's like, are you coming home? I was like, but I have a patient that's laboring. I think I might have to go back in. So he's constantly trying to get me home.
So, of course, I'm like really worried that will she make it here tonight, right? Because her call is not to be on a stage talking to a microphone. Her call is to be with the mom and with the baby. I just wanted to say something about this idea about this call that you have, because that is another thing I think that connects you with midwives, because for them it wasn't just about the work or a job. It was, for many of them, a spiritual calling. They would talk about the fact that if they didn't do this midwife work, they wouldn't be well, in a very literal sense, that they would be mentally, physically sick, because this was what the work that they were supposed to be doing. And it makes such a difference, right?
It does.
In terms of how you see, you're not seeing your work as watching the clock or whatever, but and many of them felt they were doing God's work, And so that sense, and not only did folks have an opportunity to observe that kind of spiritual call in the birthing space, but because they were black, because they were living in the community, because they were going to the same churches, because they knew each other's mamas and their grandmothers long, and a lot of that is in the book, that this is, they weren't seeing someone. And you weren't, I keep going back to that story, but these were your peers talking about you this way. But these were women that were respected, right? Because they knew them. They knew them.
Right.
Yeah. And one of the wonderful questions that you asked when we talked is, what is it that physicians can learn from midwives, right? Because midwives are always, doctors are always thinking that we're going to teach midwives, right? That we're going to, there's All My Babies is a film that's shown quite often now, and you may have seen it. But All My Babies, when I was at the medical school in New Jersey, they would show it to the medical students as to teach them what not to do, which is, i.e., not to care, right? I mean, not to have this bond with the community. So many of the midwives in this book, one of the midwives set up a community center. One of the midwives was a teacher and a principal. One of the midwives was the director of the choir. So they had this whole person relationship. So how hard is it when you're in the space that you're in to kind of develop those kind of bonds, and how do you do that?
Well, for me, I think it's not hard for me because, like I said again, I think it's a gift. I actually am a consultant, so I don't tend to have my own patients. I usually consult patients that are complicated. There are a few that I will come in and definitely be there for the delivery. And so when I meet patients, I usually have to tell them I don't deliver, or I have to promise that I'm going to come in and deliver them, because I do establish it. I think it takes a skill